feel like I really understand that we have a responsibility to change the narrative around what we are delivering to young people in the classroom. But I would describe the actual day-to-day learning side of things very challenging.
Picture this: a press conference in South Florida. Cameras rolling. A wildlife biologist stands in front of a table covered in tracking equipment and announces, with a completely straight face, that the state is going to fight one of the worst invasive species disasters in American history by releasing more snakes into the swamp. Not fewer snakes. More. The internet did what the internet does. Late-night hosts cracked jokes. Comment sections filled up with people asking if Florida had officially run out of good ideas. Florida man releases more pythons to fix python problem became the kind of headline that wrote its own punchline. It sounded like satire. It sounded like the setup to a bad horror movie where the cure is worse than the disease. Except it wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a mistake. It was one of the strangest, most quietly brilliant strategies to ever come out of a wildlife crisis. And by the time people stopped laughing, thousands of these creatures were already doing exactly what they were designed to do, working from the inside of an ecosystem that had been under siege for decades. And buried underneath that story is an even stranger twist, one involving a parasite nobody planned for, a threat that turned the hunters into the hunted, and a scientific mess that is still unfolding right now in the swamps of Florida. So let's rewind, because to understand why anyone would deliberately release more snakes into the Everglades, you first have to understand just how badly the Everglades needed saving in the first place. The story starts, like so many ecological disasters do, with the exotic pet trade. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, and for decades they were popular in the American reptile trade as pets and showpieces for collectors who liked owning something enormous and vaguely terrifying. They were sold in pet stores. They were bred by hobbyists. And because these snakes can grow to well over 15 feet long and live for 2 decades, more than a few owners eventually realized they were in over their heads. Some pythons escaped. Some were deliberately released when they got too big to handle. A destructive hurricane in the early 1990s is believed to have torn open a breeding facility and scattered even more of them into the wild. In South Florida, it turned out, was practically designed for a Burmese python to thrive. Warm year-round, thick with cover, and absolutely overflowing with prey that had never evolved any defense against a predator like this. By the 2000s, wildlife officials realized they weren't dealing with the occasional loose pet anymore. They were dealing with an established, breeding, spreading population. The federal government eventually banned the import of Burmese pythons in 2012, but by then the horse, or rather the snake, was already out of the barn. The scale of the damage is genuinely hard to process. These are apex predators with almost no natural enemies in Florida, capable of swallowing prey close to their own body weight. Researchers have documented pythons preying on more than 80 different species, everything from marsh rabbits and wading bird to full-grown deer and even alligators. In areas where pythons have been established the longest, populations of raccoons, opossums, and rabbits have collapsed by well over 90%. Bobcats, one of the top native predators in the region, have seen their numbers crater because the pythons are eating the same prey they depend on to survive. And the truly infuriating part for wildlife managers is how difficult these animals are to actually find. A python's camouflage is extraordinary. They can lie completely motionless in dense sawgrass a few feet from a trained hunter and go completely unnoticed. Estimates for how many pythons are currently living in the Everglades ecosystem range from the tens of thousands into potentially 6 figures, and nobody has ever managed to pin down an exact number because the snakes are simply too good at disappearing. Florida tried the obvious solutions first. Public hunting programs. A python bounty system that pays trained contractors by the foot for every snake they remove, with bonus payments for verified nests. An annual python hunting competition that draws hunters from around the country and turns snake removal into a kind of extreme sport. All of it helped. None of it was close to enough. Removing a python here and there while the population reproduces in the tens of thousands is like bailing out a flooding boat with a teaspoon. Wildlife biologists needed something smarter. And that's where the idea that got everybody laughing actually came from. Here's the problem with hunting an animal that's nearly invisible. You can walk right past a 15-foot python and never know it's there. So a team of biologists, most notably out of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, came up with an approach that sounds almost too simple to work. If you can't find the pythons, let a python find them for you. The method is called the Scout Snake Program, and it works like this. Researchers capture male pythons, because male pythons are relentlessly driven to find mates during breeding season, and they surgically implant small radio transmitters into them. Then they release these tagged males back into the wild and simply wait. During breeding season, which runs roughly from November through April, these tagged males do what nature built them to do. They travel, sometimes for miles, tracking the scent trail of a much larger, reproductively active female. The research team follows the radio signal, and when the male eventually locates his target, the humans are right behind him, ready to remove the breeding female before she can lay a single egg. It is, in the most literal sense, using the snake's own biology as a weapon against the population. A single male scout snake, over the course of a season, can lead researchers to females carrying tens of thousands of future pythons in the form of unlaid eggs. Some of the females captured this way have measured over 17 feet long and weighed well over 100 pounds, which gives you a sense of just how many eggs a single successful catch can eliminate from the ecosystem in one afternoon. The program has now been running for over a decade, and the numbers are staggering by conservation standards. More than 40,000 pounds, upwards of 20 tons, of invasive python have been physically removed from just a couple hundred square miles of habitat in Southwest Florida since the effort began. Researchers estimate the Scout snake technique alone has prevented tens of thousands of python eggs from ever hatching. In an ecosystem that sprawls across nearly 8,000 square miles, that is still a fraction of the total problem. But it's the most efficient tool anyone has found so far, and it's the reason biologists currently have dozens of these tagged males roaming the swamp at any given time, functioning as living, breathing informants. This is the part of the story that got mocked online. Florida releases more pythons to catch pythons is a headline that writes itself as a punchline. But strip away the joke, and what you actually have is one of the more elegant pieces of applied ecology in recent memory. A program that turns an invasive species' own reproductive drive into the mechanism of its own downfall. And it's working, slowly, painfully, one radio signal at a time. Biologists tracking the scout snakes have started to notice something encouraging. The males are having a harder time finding mates, and the females they do locate tend to be smaller than the massive matriarchs captured in earlier years. That's the kind of signal ecologists look for when a suppression effort is starting to bend a population curve in the right direction. But this isn't actually the twist the title is promising you. The Scout Snake program is clever, but it isn't the part of this story that stunned researchers. The real gut punch came from something nobody released on purpose. Something that hitched a ride. While all of this python removal was happening in plain sight, something much smaller and much stranger was spreading quietly through the same swamps. And almost nobody outside a handful of research labs noticed until it was already too late to stop. Burmese pythons, it turns out, didn't come to Florida alone. Tucked inside their lungs, they carried a parasite from Southeast Asia called Raeliatella orientalis, a small worm-like organism known as a pentastome. In their native range, this parasite and the python have had thousands of years to reach an evolutionary truce. The python's immune system has learned to tolerate it. It's an unwelcome tenant, but rarely a fatal one. Florida's native snakes never got that memo. When researchers began finding native species like pygmy rattlesnakes, banded water snakes, and black races infected with the same parasite, they realized the pythons had inadvertently exported their unwanted travel companion straight into an ecosystem that had zero defenses against it. And unlike the python, native snakes are not handling it well. The parasite lives in the lungs and windpipe, feeding on blood and clogging the very airway a snake needs to breathe. In species that never evolved alongside it, infections can leave the animal anemic, weakened, and struggling to draw breath. Researchers at Stetson University made a particularly alarming discovery when they examined dead pygmy rattlesnakes in a wildlife refuge more than 100 miles from where the pythons live, and found the parasitic worms had grown even larger inside these native snakes than they typically do inside the pythons that originally carried them. It was a sign that the parasite wasn't just surviving in its new hosts. It was thriving. What makes this genuinely unsettling is the spread. This isn't confined to the python's known range in the deep south of the state anymore. It has been documented working its way north, showing up in native snakes well outside the Everglades, in counties nowhere near established python territory. Nobody released this on purpose. Nobody could. A parasite doesn't need permission or program budget. It just needs a host, an insect intermediary to complete its life cycle and time. And it has had plenty of both. Scientists studying the phenomenon describe it using a term called parasite spillover, when an invasive species introduces a pathogen that then leaps into native wildlife that never had a chance to build up resistance. It is one of the quieter, less photogenic consequences of invasive species, the kind that doesn't make for dramatic footage of a hunter wrestling a giant snake out of a canal, but may ultimately do just as much damage to Florida's native reptile populations over the long run. So here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. Florida spent years being mocked for deliberately releasing radio-tagged pythons back into the wild as a hunting tool, a strategy that, while strange-sounding, was carefully engineered and genuinely effective. Meanwhile, the actual uncontrolled biological threat, the one nobody planned, approved, or could have stopped, was already loose in the swamp the entire time, riding along in the lungs of every single python that made it into Florida in the first place. Once the scale of the parasite spread became clear, research teams at places like the University of Florida and the University of Central Florida shifted a significant amount of their attention toward understanding exactly how far it could go. And the honest answer, even now, is that nobody fully knows. Wildlife ecologists studying the parasite have pointed out that it's already been found well outside the boundaries anyone expected, and there's no clear ceiling on how much further it could travel as native snakes move, interact, and share the same insect populations that help spread the parasite's eggs from host to host. The concern isn't limited to a handful of unlucky reptiles in the Everglades. Some researchers now openly wonder whether this could eventually become a broader, multi-state problem for native snake populations across the southeastern United States. There's also a genuinely eerie detail buried in the research. Some of the very same python meat that hunters in Florida are legally permitted to harvest and sell. The meat that's turned up in python curry and other novelty dishes served at local events carries a small risk of being contaminated by these parasites if it isn't properly cooked. It's a strange full circle moment. An invasive predator that devastated the food web, hunted down and turned into a dinner special, still carrying a biological warning label from thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, the Scout Snake program keeps running, season after season, because it remains one of the only tools that actually works at scale against an animal built to disappear. The biologists running it will tell you, without much drama, that they don't expect to ever fully eliminate Burmese pythons from South Florida. The realistic goal has shifted from eradication to suppression, keeping the population low enough that native wildlife has a fighting chance to recover, while researchers scramble to understand and hopefully contain the parasite problem before it spreads any further north. It's a strange kind of ongoing war, fought with radio collars, breeding season stakeouts, microscopes, and a whole lot of uncertainty. And it is, in its own way, one of the more remarkable modern examples of how deeply and unpredictably an ecosystem can be reshaped by a handful of escaped pets decades earlier. So back to that press conference and all the jokes that followed it. The people laughing at the idea of Florida releasing more snakes into an already snake-infested swamp weren't wrong, that it sounded absurd. They were just missing the context. The Scout Snake program wasn't an act of desperation or incompetence. It was a calculated, science-driven response built around one simple insight. Sometimes the most efficient way to find an animal that doesn't want to be found is to let one of its own kind lead you straight to it. And in a strange twist that no headline writer could have planned better, the real snake-killing creatures in this story were never the pythons that got all the attention. They were the microscopic parasites those pythons carried with them the whole time, spreading quietly through Florida's native wildlife while the world was busy laughing at a different, much more visible story. That's the part that tends to stun people when they hear the full picture. The joke wasn't really about biocontrol gone wrong. The real punchline was that the actual threat, the one nobody planned or announced or joked about, had already slipped past everyone's radar years earlier. And by the time anyone noticed, it had already spread further than anyone could easily undo. Florida's python fight isn't over. It's not close to over. The scout snakes are still out there right now, moving through sawgrass and cypress stands, quietly leading researchers to the next generation of eggs that will never get the chance to hatch. And somewhere in those same swamps, an invisible parasite continues writing its own chapter of this story, one native snake at a time, in a battle most people will never see coming until the numbers are already impossible to ignore. It's easy to talk about scout snakes and pentastorms like they're characters in a nature documentary, but there are real people wading chest deep into canals at night to make any of this work, and their stories are just as strange as the science. The men and women who do this for a living aren't thrill seekers looking for a viral video moment. Most of them will tell you they got into python removal because they love wildlife, not because they enjoy killing anything. It's physically brutal work. Hunters spend entire nights slogging through waist-high water in the dark, scanning the edges of canals with headlamps, listening for the telltale slither in the brush. Bites are common enough that most veteran hunters have long since stopped counting them. Heat exhaustion, alligators, venomous snakes, and simple exhaustion are just part of the job description. And then there's the emotional weight of it. Removing an animal that can weigh more than the hunter carrying it, over and over, season after season, takes a toll that doesn't show up in the official statistics. Several of the program's most experienced hunters have spoken about the strange guilt that comes with the job, the sense that they're not hunting for sport but performing something closer to a mercy killing on behalf of an entire ecosystem that can't defend itself. The pythons, after all, didn't choose to be here. They were dropped into a world they didn't ask for by people who could no longer manage them as pets. And now they are being systematically removed because the damage they cause, however unintentional, has become too severe to ignore.